So how are you guys?
Good.
Good. Nice mug of cup of
Yeah,
coffee there.
I'm just completely waking up.
Yeah,
this
welcome to my
morning.
world.
Yes. Well, yeah, this is like, nighttime for you, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I woke up. I cooked hash browns. I'm ready.
Oh, those sound yummy. I have had nothing.
Wow.
Hash
Oh
browns are
man.
good.
I did. I got pork sausage and cooked it up, and then I grilled the potatoes in the pork sausage grease and added shallots and peppers from the garden. And
And what time did you get up? I mean, the time preparation. What time did you get up?
7:30.
Okay. Yeah.
What are we going to talk about today?
The weather.
The weather is beautiful here in Virginia Beach. It's like 80 degrees and sunny.
Yeah, it's going to get really hot here today, I think.
Yeah.
A little bit later. So we're not really going to talk about weather, are we?
I hope not.
Can.
I got something for you guys to chew on really quickly. I heard on the radio that Yes is having their 50th anniversary tour.
Ooh.
I heard that yesterday.
Who is what's the lineup?
As far as I know, I think it's the original. I could be wrong. I really don't know, but I'm imagining it's the original minus Chris Squire.
Right.
But I get the inkling that it's Steve, and I'm not sure if Wakeman's with them.
I was gonna say Rick.
But when we saw them, what was that? 50 and that show. That was incredible.
Yeah,
that game was incredible.
I definitely enjoyed that show. That was a good show.
They're just always entertaining, and just good musicianship. And I kind of, I think that they went through lineup changes that really kind of complemented them, over the years.
Yeah.
But they always kind of have that kind of core sound, which I always thought was really great.
Yeah.
Well, you guys ever hear? You ever hear a Relayer? You guys know that record?
Yes. Oh yeah.
Yeah. With the Gates of Delirium,
Mm-hmm.
And when they had, I think it was Patrick Moraz on keyboards,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of, it was that's a great record. I just love that album, even though it's not their traditional kind of trajectory, but I always liked with how that kind of sounded.
My introduction to Yes was the 90125 or whatever it was album.
Yeah. That was Trevor, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't that like Trevor Rabin? So that was a different kind of, that was more of like the 80s.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, but that's like the gateway bands, Yeah. Then you get into the 70s, when they.
Yeah, for me it was all Yes. I really got into Yes when I was young because I just I couldn't take Geddy. I couldn't take Geddy Lee's voice. It wasn't until later, until actually probably around the time that I met you, Tony, that it was like, okay, I have a newfound love for Rush, and then it was all over from there. Yeah. But it was always like Yes first, and then Rush came in. So yeah.
Well, they were sort of like, I think they were in that Zeppelin-esque category. You always had like Zeppelin, Rush, Yes. They were always trying to like emulate each other in terms of their vocal sounds, right? You kind of had, especially Ian was trying to do a lot of that, and back in the early days of Rush, Geddy was trying to be Robert Plant.
Oh yeah, and admits it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
On that first album, he was that, and it sounded, even that kind of bluesy or kind of feel they had really going on. But I always loved Rush. I mean, even when I was a kid, and
they're so good.
Yeah, I'm really sad they are done.
Yeah, they are definitely done. Yeah. But they kind of deserve it.
well, yeah, they did deserve the break. Did you guys see the Time Stand Still documentary about their last gig?
Mm-mm.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, you guys should watch that. I think it's all over Netflix or whatever. I have an Xfinity streaming thing, but they just made it. Well, actually, it might be a few years now, but it's called Time Stand Still, and it tracks the band on their last tour, on their farewell tour. So like, right, and it kind of like gets into all these interviews. It's not like your traditional documentary where they have just inundated with concert footage. There's like a little concert footage, but it's a lot of talking interviews with the guys. And it actually takes you through the preparation and what they had to go through to kind of get to that last show,
Wow.
Yeah. And how like Neil was kind of cajoled by Alex to do it because Neil didn't want to do it.
Right.
But after the end of it, it was really neat watching those guys kind of come to the end of their career. Crazy.
Yeah.
And it's kind of sad too that we don't have bands that can last that long anymore.
Well, that's
the nature of the industry, I guess.
Yeah, it's the nature of the industry, and like I said, there's hardly any bands that are going to last 25 years or more anymore. I mean, like I said, Pearl Jam's like one of the last ones that are still going. Other than that,
you've got some old bands like Dead and Company, and I mean, there's some. I mean, the Allman Brothers. I guess they're not in nearly the shape they're in, but Warren Haynes has been around since the early or the late '80s, and at least playing with them. And
is he still doing Government Mule?
Yeah,
yeah.
But he's he goes back for Allman Brothers shows.
I think there's a lot of musicians. Not too recently, Jeff Berlin made a comment, something I kind of always liked. He said, you always can tell the professionals because they last a long time, but they're never really, after the glory and the fame. And I'm paraphrasing what he said, right? This idea that, like someone like Warren, right? I mean, he's in so many projects, throughout the years, and his lasting power is that he's always working, right? But it's so rare that you get like a nucleus of one band that can last like yes, come on, 50 years. Yeah. I mean, it's almost unheard of.
Well, the other part of that is what else would they do? I mean, it's like the Rolling Stones.
Right?
If they stopped, if this is funny, there's a
what is Keith gonna do? Like work at a burger joint or something?
Right. I mean, there's absolutely not. This is all that they've done their entire life, and the only way that they can really make money is to go on tour and release an album here and there. And I mean, that's what they know. That's it. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Good for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And today, like you said, today is completely different than it was back then in terms of record sales and touring even. I mean, it's just a completely different game.
Yeah. I kind of wish it was like that in some ways, because there is something kind of neat about, I think, having a career in recording as opposed to, performance, because I know it's kind of the way the tide is moving, right? Where the albums kind of back up the live gigs now. Whereas, back when we were, younger, and all these bands we love to listen to is sort of, this idea that you had a recording career, right? And then your performances were there to kind of support the album. This is the way I've always understood it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of neat. And how about like Steely Dan? I mean, they couldn't have done what they did. I mean,
oh my gosh,
anymore. They were just pretty much a studio band.
Well, they were a studio band. It actually wasn't until
later
15 years that they actually
did shows.
Even considered. That's one show I'm so mad that I will never see. It's so bad.
Walter, you ever see them? Have you never? You never seen them?
I've never seen. I've always wanted to see them. I think that's just they were very unique in what they did and how they brought it to the forefront and brought it to popular music. I just love Walter and Donald. They've got this like chemistry that just it's amazing. I love it. I love their souls are just like, oh man, that's sick, and that's on the radio.
And like, and what's neat is like I was watching something with those guys too, and they were talking about how they recorded Peg, and how they they auditioned all these different guitar players, and they were all awesome guitar players for just that solo, like the middle solo, until they found some guy just kind of did a thing where this really kind of slinky. Well, you guys heard the lead, right? This kind of really kind of slinky thing that goes between the strings. Like, oh, that sounds good. We'll keep that one.
Right.
But they had like 7 different or 8 different guys playing leads on that. And I forget which interview I saw. They kind of show in the studio those guys working together, but they were neat. Like they actually know their stuff too. Like Fagan knows harmony.
Oh yeah.
Going back to something we talked about a couple of weeks back, like he can break chord structures down and know, what extensions do and how things resolve and then put it all together, and they have this really kind of nice soft tone to their sound, which is great. Yeah.
And on top of that, not only do they know what they're doing, but they also know what they're doing in the recording studio.
Right.
The one album, they didn't use anything but just putting mics on instruments and spent the whole album just making sure that the mic was perfectly placed. No like compression or EQ or anything like that. It's just all perfectly, like everything's perfect. It's like, wow, that takes some time and some money, which back then labels were willing to do.
Yeah, great stuff. Golden age.
Yeah,
golden age of records, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. It'd be cool to talk about actually how to write harmonies.
Let's do it. That's a good one. I like that.
So that's just an idea I'm throwing out there. So I've been playing in this a couple of different jazz duos recently, And I've started doing this one with a vocalist flautist, and it's been really cool having somebody. She's really versatile because she can, play all these old jazz standards, but then we can do some of the cooler, 60s, 70s jazz tunes, and she's, instrumental tunes where she's focused on the flute, and how to voice the guitar with the flute has been an interesting thing for me because I've never really played with a flute player. And so trying to figure out harmonies and how to put our instruments in separate frequency ranges in order to bring out both instruments. It's been fun to do. So we've been doing this tune called Record a May. It's an old, I think it's Joe Henderson, old jazz tune. It's got a kind of Latin flair to it. And we've been working on writing harmonies for it and things using, up a third from the melody, or doing contrary motion, kind of Bach-esque contrary motion, right, and really trying to work within the chords, but trying to create something interesting. So I just thought it'd be a cool topic to talk about. Yeah, I mean, what experience do you guys have writing harmonies? I know Aaron's done it in Dawn.
Yeah, well, yeah. I studied the Beatles and Simon and Garfunkel and the old that kind of harmony that happened there. So that's kind of where my mind always goes. Sometimes I get that kind of Bach kind of influence for some odd reason as well.
Remember when Andrew did the contrary motion in the intro of Dawn, and he was playing the bass line, right, but instead of playing the melody with us, he descended the other way. Yeah, it was really cool sounding. I never forgot that.
Yeah,
I think a lot of it, when it comes to harmony, is really about style, in terms of what is happening in musical movements, in the entire musical periods, right? Because everything we're talking about with like contrary, oblique motion, parallel, that kind of thing, it's really relegated for Western music, this kind of European Western music, which we've borrowed, as Aaron said, into, the Beatles were doing a lot of that kind of stuff, bands I was into, like King's X. I know Aaron's not particularly a fan of those guys. I really enjoyed them because of the fact they could take, the three vocals they have in their three-piece and really use this attention to how certain harmony movements work. But then, if you get into like jazz, it breaks all those rules. Now we're in different, harmonic territory where different things apply, as you guys know. And then as we move, let's say, into the rock idiom, I remember, in the 90s, I was a huge fan of Alice in Chains. I love those guys, primarily because, not so much the guitar work, because they changed the harmonic rules a lot. Like Cantrell was doing a lot of forts and a lot of really darker kind of harmonic movements below, the tonics of Lane, so it was like he was like turning everything around in its head. So I think a lot of how we write harmonies in our style, either I don't know, in a sense, adheres to the rules we've learned growing up, or kind of breaks those rules. Me, how I write harmonies, I tend to just kind of now trust the ear a lot. I'm not so sure if that's a big revelation, in terms of my own work. But I think when I go to sit down and I compose a piece, as like Aaron and I talked about audiating last week, and trying to hear things, or maybe 2 weeks ago, I try to almost decide, like, what am I going for in the overall effect of the harmonies, Let's put it this way. I think gone are the days for me where I write a bass line and then I try to write a harmony on the top. I don't think that way anymore, although I think it's incredibly useful because it's got a lot of sort of a lot of applications for certain songs. But I think for me, I tend to want to be more experimental, and it's only musical sound, so some experiments just burn out and don't work. Yeah. But I kind of like those too. I like the ones that don't work. I'm like, why did that not just happen? Why did that harmonies tend to clash? And I remember that, and I catalog it, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, as well. I'll try to, unless I'm going for a specific effect, I'll let my ear kind of do what I need it to do. But if I'm going into a song and I'm trying to compose a certain kind of a idea based off of fourths or whatnot like that. Just kind of say, okay, well, I'm specifically going to try to break what I normally do, and I'm going to kind of create this thing and kind of use those concepts in this piece.
Right.
Otherwise, your ear is just generally going to kind of take you where it needs to go.
Yeah, an example of this would be like when I was teaching at our studio in State College. I remember I used this lesson a lot on the "Chic Your Booty" album that Frank Zappa did. There was a track where it was like a lot of just conversation stuff, and he did this little thing on the piano where he just actually hit a minor second, just a black and white key right next to each other, ding, just kind of hit it down there. And I would love the effect of that minor second harmony placed right at the appropriate spot in the middle of this thing he was doing. And I remember when I was teaching, I said to students, I said, okay, if you want to know what a minor second sounds like, it creates this really kind of interesting flutter because the frequencies are so close together. So when I write now, I think of those kinds of things and saying, what do I want here in this musical space? Do I want a fluttering kind of effect? Do I want something open and airy? Like, I think like when Mozart used to write, he would be like, what do I picture here? I picture wind moving. Okay, let's put the flutes up here in this area, and put them like, in the fourth or whatever. Harmony was there. So I think a lot of it is sort of auditory effect and what the effect is going to be afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely.
My students, when they come to me and I say to them, well, at least it used to be this way, not so much anymore, but back in the 80s when they would come and say, and I say, what do you want to do in terms of, learning harmony? And they would say, I want to do like what Judas Priest does. Like their only conception of what harmony was to take two guitars and harmonize them in thirds.
Dude,
that was it. That's all they knew how to do. And that's like, okay. That's the big,
Metallica,
yeah.
Sevenfold.
Right. Yeah, right. And so I think there's, again, it's style. It's all about the style of how harmony works in a particular piece, but that should only be the beginning of it. I think there's a lot of other interesting ways to do it, and not everything has to be harmonized. I don't believe that. There's a lot of places where unison effects work great too.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Doing things in unison and working there. So, and I can't sit there and tout. I'm not a master of harmony. I wish I were. I wish I were like Bach. But I don't, but who is, right? Yeah. So I think I just kind of trust the ear a lot now.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to start. If you want to do things like Metallica and Avenged Sevenfold and just kind of do that natural thirds harmony, sure, that's a great place to start and kind of get your basis in, okay, this is what harmony is, but then kind of branch off of that. There's so many other ways of kind of approaching harmony, like a suspension. One person, you start with unison and then have the other person descend from that point, and it creates this kind of thing that's happening. There's so many avenues you can kind of play with harmony.
I like chords too. I'm not so sure if this is a different kind of conversation, but what I'm really into now, more so than I was in the past, is more about static chord structures and hearing them as a texture. And what I mean by that is, like, for me, like, I'm really the more I mature as a guitar player, I love colors. I love hearing things like a color palette. So my playing has really evolved from when I was younger to being kind of this shreddy kind of guy into more of like being a textural kind of guitarist. So when I think of harmony now, I think about kind of creating these vertical chord structures on the instrument, and how little partials and different kind of overtones kind of make that chord structure either sound really strong or really weak, or have a lot of force, or more some push towards resolving to other things. And just, in this kind of artistic way, kind of, what do I want to have now in kind of this musical period that's kind of there. So yeah, I think harmony is a really interesting definition. I'm not sure how to define it now in my own playing, if that makes sense.
I think what you're talking about, it goes hand in hand with the single line harmonies we're talking about, though, because when I'm writing a harmony, I'm thinking about the chord that I'm playing over, and I'm using my ear too, but I'm starting with I'm looking at the chord, and if somebody's on the root of the chord, I'm specifically choosing to play the third, fifth, or seventh, and then moving away from that based on my ears. That's kind of my starting point. So if you're talking about creating static chord structures, you could still have those single lines built into there, You know, having, I think about in jazz when you have like a 2-5-1 and you add the tensions in order to have, you know, a chromatic resolve. I mean, you could have this, you either have it played by one instrument or you have everybody doing that at once. I think it all works out though.
Yeah, and I think what a lot of people don't really think about either is the fact that, you know, anything can be interpreted as a tonic, which I think is a really cool thing too. Even Schoenberg and Harmony Lyra talked about this, where you can have a particular chord form, like you're saying, right? And at any one point, any note within that chord can serve as a tonic to another key or to another resolution. So I think one of the dangers today, and I don't know if this is a truism, but one of the dangers for me, I think, in teaching harmony is being very careful not to say, all right, well, this is always C major 7, let's say, and this C major 7 resolves to or moves to this next chord in a progression. Again, that is a stylistic kind of expression for how that goes. But there are so many tones in a C major 7 that can actually be reinterpreted for another movement, right? So a good example, this would be like in a fully diminished 7th chord, like these symmetrical forms, right? Every chord, every tone in that fully diminished 7th chord can serve as a leading tone to another key, right? So it's like really cool that you can, when you're teaching harmony, you have to kind of teach students that these vertical structures you're building literally are made of tonics that can serve in different ways. They can serve as a tonic to their own key, or they can serve as a dominant to another key, or whatever the case is. And it's up to you to kind of figure out where we're navigating, how we're kind of putting things together.
I love the idea of the diminished chord being, I mean, it's this complex, it's this thing you could teach, you know, it's this half step, whole step pattern put together, but it's really there in, if you're going to actually use it, it's a way to get from chord to chord. Like you're saying, in order to change keys, the diminished, that's how I think of it. I use it as a tool to get from one chord to another, like a bridge.
Yeah, it's a vehicle chord, right?
Yeah.
It's as much the same way. For those who don't know this, right? I'm assuming because, you know, we talk and teach this in the studio a lot, that diminished and dominant are one and the same. They're literally of the same family. They're made of the same stuff, which is basically all that resolving power. So yeah, so you have to look at them like, yeah, you have much the same way that you would not just rest on a dominant chord for its own kind of inherent quality. Use a dominant to move. It's a transition. It's a vehicle to push your ear somewhere else. So yeah, I think diminished are great. It's really, you know, I really wish we could see that diminished family of chords kind of resurface in modern music. I mean, maybe you guys have a different opinion, but I think that we've gotten away from that again because that stylistically, you know, Western music relied heavily on diminished movements, but then we move away from that. Those sounds tend to go away, you know, probably because of the harshness and the tritone mixed in there, and you know, and all that. But I think it's a really powerful chord form, incredibly powerful.
It's still all over the place in the jazz world.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Yeah, but most modern ears, you won't hear it on pop radio. That's for sure.
No,
we should.
Yeah, well, we should absolutely. We were talking about Steely Dan before and how they were popular music. Now, in my observation, we have gone to a rhythmic based music rather than a melodic or harmony based music. Everything is very rhythmic right now. Very, 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 very rhythmic.
People want to dance.
Dance, and even like if you take heavy metal, they usually are taking one tone and just kind of playing with the rhythm. I mean, look at bands like Meshuggah.
Or Opeth did that, right? Yeah, Deliverance to take that one. Actually, they just took in that whole last part of that. They took just like an E chord or whatever it was and just created this really, but the effect sounds amazing. Like you get these really cool expressions.
Absolutely. I mean, in that kind of case where it's like the 16 bar phrase, it's like, wow, that's cool. But again, it's all rhythm based. And like you said, Joe, there's a lot of dance going on and EDM and
that's great stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It's wonderful. But where, to me, moving away from things that are harmony based, that are melodically based, and like the days of Simon and Garfunkel, that just doesn't happen anymore. The Beatles, that doesn't happen anymore. Creedence Clearwater
Clearwater.
Revival, the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young,
Mhm.
those types of things are not as prominent as what they were back then. I mean, it's just
But
doesn't
those
happen.
bands, the bands that are doing those things are still playing the major festivals and a lot of the mid-level festivals. You know, there's bands like Lake Street Dive they have amazing harmonies, and Wolfpack is another band that's out right now.
Mhm.
Amazing harmonies. Those bands are still out there, but they're not making mainstream radio.
Yes, yes. I think my point was more along the mainstream radio. What's popular today is not the same that it was 20, 30 years ago. Before, you could actually hear a lot of this going on. Now it's just it's not.
But to me, it's kind of a snowball effect where now you have younger generations listening to the music on the radio, and they're trying to create their own music based off that, which is in turn creating more music that's lacking in harmonic areas. Man, my buddy went to a EDM festival, and it's not his thing really, but he went and he had a good time. But you know, after a few days of EDM music, he was ready for something a little bit more melodic, and somebody mixed in, I think, a Simon and Garfunkel song into their EDM song, and all the folks around were like really into it, and they're like, "This is awesome." And he's like, "Yeah, it's Simon and Garfunkel." Like none of them had ever heard it. They thought the DJ was coming up with it,
Right.
and so like
That's crazy.
the people creating a lot of the new music don't have the background they're not interested in the older styles of music.
Right.
Well, I think that's again, this is really about how it's introduced to us and how we're kind of exposed to it, you know. And it's more for me. There is a distinction between knowing how the mechanics of harmony work and then what the effects of that are. So, like like you said, Simon and Garfunkel sounds like Simon and Garfunkel not because of what they put together in the harmonies, but because how everything else mixes with harmony for their composition. So their vocal ranges, right? How they're using their instrumentation, just the overall effect of their sound, I think plays a big role. But you strip all that away, they're doing nothing different than like the classical guys were doing or the Beatles were doing, right? There's just the harmony still kind of works in this kind of same fashion. And since you're kind of talking about how people respond to harmony, it's really neat too to think about. I remember when I was a comp student, I had a teacher who was of Greek ethnicity, and he was all about Greek culture, and he got me really into Greek philosophy and how the Greeks kind of used musical harmony. And we don't really have a lot of the music from the Greeks anymore because it kind of all just went away, in the historical record. But they actually were into a lot about proportion. Like there's something out there called the golden spiral. Later on, centuries later, Fibonacci, the mathematician, came up with something called the Fibonacci sequence. And they borrow from these guys that are about, perfect proportions, at every size. In musical harmony, it's really weird. You guys know this, that if you take a tone, break it down into the harmonic series, right? What's creepy is that the harmonic series mimics musical harmony that we teach, right? So you have like the fundamental, the next overtone above is the fifth, the next overtone above is the third. It's actually a triad. And then as you go up the harmonic series, you get into sevens, So I guess my point is the reason why certain harmonies sound good to people and are acceptable and consonant is because they're mimicking things that are natural. So if you get into things like Zappa did, where he's breaking a lot of those rules and getting to dissonance, people don't like it or they don't understand it because it kind of goes against what their natural ears tell them sounds good or sounds bad. And you build a musical style around that kind of stuff, and it becomes even more distant for people to kind of connect to. So I think the lasting power for all these bands is because they're playing with natural sounding harmonies that resonate in a consonant way with many people, and then the rest is just dressing, and all the good stuff, that you kind of put on there.
I don't know. I think people are conditioned with music. I mean, it's pop using the 1-5-6-4 over and over again. People are just kind of conditioned to hearing this because it sounds good. I mean, that's been used for decades and decades, and people kind of hear these harmonies, and you recreate that no matter how with a rhythm and some different instrumentation on top of it, it's guaranteed a pop hit. So I think a lot of it is conditioning. And I don't know. While you guys were talking, I was thinking about, because we were talking about rhythm and Simon and Garfunkel and what it is today. I think that back then, information was not readily available. It was in books, and you had to go to a library, and it was the whole thing. Now it's the internet. So, like Jimmy, and even to the Beatles, the extent. I remember hearing a story about how it was either Paul or John drove, a half an hour to the next town just to learn how to play a G chord. I mean, driving a half an hour to learn how to play a G chord. That's crazy. So back then, it wasn't technically based. It was more along the lines of something that people could readily get their hands on, which was harmony and melody. Those are the things that people were kind of going after back then. That was it. But now, with the internet being so readily available, and everybody kind of growing up through the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and the implementation of multi-track, because before then multi-track didn't exist, so it was a matter of going into the studio and then just laying it down on tape, whereas later on it was a matter of going into the studio and redoing that guitar line 50 times and then only taking the best parts and putting it together. So now technically things are different, because now it's okay, people are listening to music and trying to recreate that on their instrument, but it's not impossible, but it's up to the game, because now what they're trying to recreate on digital at home is proficiently, like, wow, this is really amazing. Whereas you go back pre 1980, mid 80s, that wasn't the goal. You weren't trying to get all those technical things fast and whatnot like that. That what hadn't happened yet. So the new kind of batch of people that are out are exposed to this crazy guitar that's really technical. And that's kind of the goal now. Whereas before it wasn't, because that wasn't available. That wasn't the goal. It was more harmony based. It was more the overall sound and the things that are going on within the instrumentation of things.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah. Joe Walsh from the Eagles says we lost the mojo.
there's no more blues. I mean, it just doesn't exist anymore in rock and roll.
Eric Clapton was in a documentary called Life in 12 Bars. I don't know if you guys saw that one. Pretty good. And it talks about Clapton's early days.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really good. You guys would like it. And he talks about that. He says that blues is dying. He says we are not doing it anymore, and it's on its death knell. Again, paraphrasing that, but and I can kind of see that. I think people are keeping it alive in bars across the country and clubs and playing it as an underground kind of thing. But we've moved away from that. You know, we've borrowed elements of pentatonic sounds, right, and bluesier sounds. But again, everything today kind of is all about this idea that musical periods have stylistic treatments of harmony. And I think what's happening now is we've just kind of pushed pentatonic flavors out the window, right, to make use for rhythmic movements, and so I don't think it's really there as much anymore. At least maybe not in the pop vein. Which is a lot of good. I mean, Joe Bonamassa is keeping blues going.
Yeah,
he's great player. And he's really doing some great work.
There's guys like Gary Clark who are out there mixing R&B and blues, fusing them really well.
Yeah.
You heard Gary Clark? He's got this, like, he'll go from singing a really classic R&B sounding song to a B.B. King sounding thing to a Jimi Hendrix thing. But
you got to keep in mind too, yeah, you're right. And I think what's happening too is that a lot of the old guys are dying off, So like one of my favorite players, Gary Moore, man, blues. Oh, I love his blues work. But as those guys leave us, they leave their art too, and the style goes. And remember, their upbringings were heavily influenced by blues players. And in some cases, like B.B. King, right? Or Albert Moore, these blues guys, they were living it. Yeah. They were living blues, like literally what blues was designed to be, in these kind of like these emotionally kind of these emotional areas where they were really feeling what they were talking about in the lyrics, and that's going away.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
You know, we're too comfortable today. So why do we need to play blues, right?
Yeah, it's
What,
true.
what do I have to be blue about?
Yeah, first world problems, man.
Yeah, yeah. So, and it's being reflected in the art a lot. So yeah, it's expected, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think music should change. I think it needs to. It needs to
always
evolve.
will.
It needs to evolve.
It always will. It always will. But I think it's important for us, as because we have the internet and everything is so readily available. I think it's important for us to acknowledge all of those things that happened in the past. That's you know, it's our job as teachers to expose these kids to all these kinds of musics that are out there, all these genres, just because it's important. If they don't, who is? You know.
Well, you think about it. You think about all three of us right now. We are historians. We are.
Yeah.
We are musical historians. You know, our job, and I remember this is since I started teaching, was to give students an exposure, as you just said, to what style has been through the periods and how different styles have different effects. And how many times have you guys talked about the backgrounds of the players? I do.
Oh yeah.
You know, when I do a Jimmy lesson, I talk about Jimmy.
Yeah.
You know, and it's important. You gotta give students that exposure, because if not, Abraham Lincoln's quote will work. And he used to say, "History forgets everybody." You know, and that's pretty true. That at certain point, as time moves along, we are forgotten. You know, and I think that's important that we kind of keep that alive in those musical fields. You know.
Yeah.
I've been really experimenting lately with taking old tunes and trying to recreate them in a way that modern ears would enjoy them. So, for example, I took this tune Boplicity by Miles Davis and Gil Evans. Miles had this period in the 50s where he was playing a lot. He was interested in classical music, and Gil Evans was a classical composer, and they wrote all these. He did this album where he had like 12 players on. He had all these different. He had a French horn, and it was a really cool album he did. But he put out the song Boplicity, which is not a bebop song. It's a very classical sounding jazz tune. And, you know, I've played it for people and it goes over people's heads a lot of times. But recently I've put a hip hop groove behind it, an R&B groove behind it. And people, I mean, it's a beautiful melody and the harmony is beautiful. And, you know, I'll be playing for Virginia Beach on Atlantic Avenue, and people of all ages stop, and as soon as it's got a modern groove behind it, they're interested and they can bop their head to it. And then you tell them it was Miles Davis, and they're surprised that it's not what they thought a Miles Davis tune was or could sound like.
Right.
And so I guess what I'm trying to do is find a way to take all this old music and repackage it in order to grab people's attention. And then if maybe I can get some people to like it, and maybe they'll go back to the original recordings, but maybe I'll just, you know, inspire people to use what's been done in their music in the future. At least, like you said, nod their heads to what's been done. Like, why do we need to recreate the wheel? There's been amazing music that's been created, so let's use it in our new music.
I've ever had a really hard time with that in my career. I'll be quite honest with you. Like, I've always felt that for me, I was more interested in what I could experiment with. I have a really hard time with music as entertainment, but that's just my personal thing. That's my personal way in. Like, for me, I don't really care if it resonates or not. And I know that's really shouldn't be the case, because music, like most arts, you know, are supposed to have audiences, right? And they're supposed to be picked up by people and really enjoy them. For me, I always felt that there was another avenue to music, and that was more, you know, this thing is sound. It's a sound phenomenon. You know, what happens if I do this? And that's been kind of my guiding, you know, sort of technique in everything that I kind of looking at. So yeah, I mean, Miles for me was one of those guys that, like, I loved him because, you know, he was doing that. He was really experimenting with different kind of tonal things, and jazz guys do that a lot. But the fact that he can go out there and sort of like appeal to masses always eluded me. I never understood how those guys could do that, but that's probably why they were geniuses. You know, no question about it. Even Coltrane was like that, right? I mean, Coltrane was breaking harmonic rules everywhere, but people loved to hear it. They loved it. they got into it, and it's really really dissonant. There's a lot of dissonances in there, I think, that don't really appeal to mass crowds, but somehow, it really connected to people. So what was it? Was there something else going on behind the scenes? I've been to jazz shows where I watch people sit back and they're literally listening. I know they're listening because I can watch their heads, and their ears actually track the melodic movement, right? Yeah, I'm sure you guys have seen that in jazz shows. People are like studying it intellectually in a way, which is really cool. But that's a niche.
Mm-hmm. Did you see that? Have you guys heard any of the new Coltrane album that was released?
No.
So they found, or they had these old recordings. There were studio recordings from, I think it was like the early 60s. And his son actually they mastered them and mixed them, mastered them, and put them out as an album. And it's really cool because it's from this period before Coltrane went quite as avant-garde. Right. And so I forgot the title of the album, but it has to do with having a foot in the old music and a foot in the new music. And it's kind of that right at that turning point in his career. There's some really cool stuff.
Going back to something the topic that you brought up, Joe, I always remember when I was a student asking teachers this a lot. Did the giants like Coltrane and Miles, did they think about what they were doing when they were writing, or did they just write it? So like everybody analyzes Coltrane's harmonic progressions today as standards, right? Mm-hmm. Well, he was able to kind of break, the secondary dominant movement. Well, okay, did he know that's what he was doing when he was writing this thing? Or did he just kind of do it? Well, there has to be some degree of knowledge, or else, how would you not know to navigate that way? So, but was he a theorist? I don't know. My mind is telling me no. I think there's a distinction between knowing the labels of how harmony works in the theory end, and is kind of knowing what it does and how it functions and the mechanics behind it. So I think a lot of those guys, had a feel, had an instinct for it. They knew how to maneuver through it, but I don't think they were drawing diagrams on the backboard. That was John McLaughlin. I think he did that. I watched McLaughlin teach, and he's got like a whole course, right, Aaron, where like he actually has a big whiteboard and a projector, and he's like, you ever see that thing? Yeah. So I think some of those guys really gravitated towards the labeling process of theory and harmony, but I think many of them just kind of practiced and experimented.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to Miles Davis. He came up under Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, and Charlie Parker just played using his ear for the most part. Right. He knew the tunes, but he didn't think of it theoretically. Whereas Dizzy Gillespie was the theorist. And when Miles was studying at, I think it was at Juilliard up in New York City when he was like 20 years old, he'd go sit down. He hated being in school. He hated it, and he felt like he was looked down upon and he wasn't learning anything useful with the modern music. But he'd go sit down with Dizzy Gillespie, and Dizzy would teach him all these, all the theory. And it was interesting. So Miles really knew his stuff. And so I would think that would rub off on Coltrane. I've been working on his book. That's why I've got a lot of Miles on my head. But yeah, so I think it really is a case by case basis.
Joe, have you worked through the Jamie Ebersol books yet?
Yeah, I've got a couple sitting right here.
Yeah, he's got some really good stuff. So I mean, if those who are listening want to get a really good jazz, education, is it too bold to say that that's a really good text? I mean, I've looked at them.
Yeah. Here's a good one, Maiden Voyage by Jamie Ebersol. Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are great. It's got all these tunes, and it shows you the, kind of the modes to play over each chord in the progression. Mm-hmm. And then they give you great backing tracks with the, where you can take out the melody, and they've got the different instruments panned, so you can.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
well, that's great. That's great.
Yeah. It's really useful. I mean, now there's all these different websites where, like jazzstandards.com, where you can get backing tracks, but I think Jamie Ebersol kind of started that. He was doing that before the internet was what it is now.
Yeah.
And they're really high quality. I mean, the instrumentation in those tracks are it's really good.
Top notch. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll check them out. Them out. I was listening to John Schofield did a lesson. I know he's another one that I just think is like a monster, player. Yeah, but it's not in a technical way, just like knowing what I'm doing and being tasteful about it. kind of thing. I always loved him as a player. He did a mode lesson, I think in the 70s, I want to say, or maybe the 80s, which is all over the internet today. Maybe you guys have seen it, right? Where he takes you through all different modal movements over chords. That is a really good one, I think, for starting players, guitar players, you know, and to kind of get a sense of how that kind of works. And I want to say Gary Burton. Is he the Vibes player? Is that him? Gary Burton. He did one too. He did, I think it's on the internet as well, where he did a workshop lesson on modes over chords, and he kind of gives some demonstrations, so you guys can, you know, people can check that one out too, which I think is highly useful. I think he broke down modes of harmonic minor and how they kind of work. So he gets into like super Locrian, all that kind of stuff they talk about, which is kind of neat, and how it kind of works over, you know, certain kind of changes.
Yeah.
He did a course with Berkeley online about exactly this. I took that back before when I was starting to get into jazz.
Yeah, it's deep.
It's a good course.
It's deep. There's a lot, you know, jazz theory is deep. It's you know, it's interesting, I think. But again, you know, if you really, you can take it and you can break these things open. You can take these modes and break them down to all these different intervals and things. At the end of it, you're creating the same, I don't want to say the same, but you're creating a really kind of similar auditory effect in the ear, you know? So I'm always careful about, you know, how much I break the theory down as opposed to what comes out of those harmonic movements.
And it's the times too, as well. You're kind of playing to the times. All those jazz guys kind of played to what was going on within the era. Even Herbie Hancock, I mean, he was all over the place as well in terms of what he was writing.
Great composer.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Great composer. I mean, that Headhunters album is just like, you know,
good night.
Yeah, it's classic stuff, you know.
Yeah, he's got a book out that I want to read too. He's one of my, I love Herbie's playing because he really did. He came up under Miles Davis playing. He can play straight bebop piano and anything from there through all the fusion, and you know, he can do it all. And he really evolved with the times and tried to make the music modern.
Yeah, always. Yeah, he was ever evolving, always.
And he's one of those last guys. I mean, he's doing seminars. He's still out performing, and he's very much kind of like Wynton Marsalis. He's one of those faces of jazz right now, like a revered person in the field, I guess.
Yeah,
I wonder if jazz is going to take the very similar path that blues did. You know, as the years go on here, you know, 20, 30 years from now, you know, it seems like that, you know, more digital music, digitally created music is really taking the forefront, as it's going to have to because of technology, if jazz is going to become a thing of the past, you know, because much of these styles probably will be, right? Who knows, you know, our grandchildren, if they're musicians, what they're going to be working with and looking back and saying, you know, back 300 years ago, we had this thing called jazz.
Yeah. That's what we do with classical music.
Right. Exactly.
Beethoven and Mozart.
Yeah. That's kind of, it's going to happen, you know, so it's,
yeah.
You know,
I wonder if popular music will be as based around instrumentation, because we're not going that way now. I mean, it's getting to be more synth and beat sample based, where the actual instrumentation of things, guitars, bass, acoustic instruments are not as prominent as what they once were.
Well, you can argue that the computer is an instrument now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
I think it's what a lot of the EDM, you know, people are going to kind of say, and again, I think there's a lot of truth in that we can look at it that way. What I can never really jive with. What did I just really use that word? I think I just used jive.
Jive?
You used
jive.
jive.
Oh, I did.
Wow.
That's an acceptable word.
What I had a hard time with the computer when I was writing computer music is the sort of the human style part. I could never do it the same way. I couldn't be as expressive in computerized composition that I could if I just picked my guitar up and composed and tracked things that way, as to be expected, because I've spent 30 years on the axe, you know. But I would love to see where electronic music evolves to the point where you can actually like really dig in and kind of be like ultra expressive with it. And I'm sure there's a lot of it out there. I'm very ignorant to those kinds of nuances in EDM work. But yeah, it would be neat to kind of have the computer evolve as a musical instrument.
Right. Right. I know they do have these track pads where there's a big black keyboard, but there's no like keys. It's just like there's like ripples, and it's based on velocity. So you can actually kind of,
I've seen that.
Yeah, that's cool. My issue, I appreciate the work that has gone into being able to make a guitar speak, the expression behind a guitar or a bass or the drums, and the years and the hours that it takes to kind of be able to craft that versus being able to go over to a keyboard. Not that you can't do this with synth based stuff.
Well, yeah, I think it's like, for me, I've always looked at guitar like a martial art in some way, where you have the very same approach, where you spend years practicing and disciplining yourself, and it's rewarding. Like, you get something out of all those years of discipline. I was playing 8 to 10 hours a day when I was getting ready to go to Berkeley, right out of high school. I had to do that, and there was a result behind that. Today, that discipline is not there, but I would be okay with that as long as those people who were composing digitally made a commitment to understand what they were doing, understand how music works. I'd be okay with it.
Right.
I don't really have a problem with composing on a computer, composing using a synthesizer or a sequencer. Like, I've written some cool music just sequencing grids on a piano roll.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about the musical parts that way. So I think it's okay as long as we don't become ignorant to how music operates.
Well, yeah, that's just it. I think that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Don't you know?
Yeah.
My interview would be like, so
yeah, we'd be like Chris Farley interviewing Paul McCartney, or something on SNL. Do you remember when you built the Mark II? That was awesome. What I can never really jive with, did I just really use that word? I think I just used jive.
Jive?
You used
Oh,
jive.
I did.
Wow.
That's an acceptable word.